Welcome to Conversations. This is your host, Michael Stone, and I am excited about today's guest because she's all about the body. Mary Mueller Shutan is an author, spiritual teacher, and she's worked for the last 15 years studying holistic medicine, energy work, body work, meditation, cult and magical practices, and spiritual healing. She combines her extensive education with personal meditative practices, direct revelation of the spiritual world, and many other modalities. She's also the author of the Spiritual Awakening Guide, Managing Psychic Abilities, the Body Diva, which we're going to talk about today, and the Complete Chord course. Mary, welcome to Conversations.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be on here with you.
Oh, awesome. Well, like I said, I read your book cover to cover and thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's one of those books you need to keep reading over and over and working with. So let's start out talking about, we're going to talk about the Body Diva book. What are you talking about when you say Body Diva, and how does understanding or experience of that support our inner health?
Well, what I'm really talking about is the consciousness of the body. It's the wisdom of the body. And so a lot of us aren't aware that we have this wonderful resource within us that we just need some skills and some tools to be able to tap into. And so really when we're talking about the Body Deva, it's the spiritual consciousness of the body, and it can answer questions, anything from why does my knee hurt to what should I do with my career to what should I be doing on my spiritual path? All of those sorts of questions can be answered within.
So your approach is an animistic approach that, looking at everything as having a soul and a spirit. How do you do that with the body? You break it down, going from the whole larger spirit to each of the parts, or how do you approach that with the Body Diva?
Yeah, so I look at everything as consciousness, which is, of course, a very animistic approach.
Yeah.
But what I do is to at first give the skills to approach the body as a whole, because the body has a consciousness or a wisdom as a whole. But also, if we consider consciousness, like it also comes in, kind of smaller parts. So throughout the book, we can work with a pelvis or a knee or even a tiny cell within us, something like that. So it's like all the things around us, we could call something the consciousness of our backyard, or we can approach a consciousness of a tree or a consciousness of a pebble, and it's the same approach, but with our bodies, and looking within ourselves.
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk a little bit about your personal journey. I look at you, you're quite young, but you've written 4 books and you've done all this stuff. At least you look young compared to me. Talk to us about your journey. How did you get started on this path and begin to develop these ideas and some very deep processes that you've created?
I was always pretty much kind of, a sensitive or feeling type of person, but I had little context for that in my life. And when I started to get into my late teens and early 20s, my sensitivities really increased, and I started having what are popularly known as, shamanic dismemberment dreams. And at age 23, I started going through what's known as a Kundalini awakening, in which a large amount of spiritual energy kind of opens up. It does open up, and it starts flowing through your body. And in doing so, what happens is like all of the stuff that's sort of held and latent in your body that requires healing or consciousness comes up to be processed. And so through this process, I did a whole lot of searching. I pretty much spent 10 years in my life from 23 to 33 just focused on my spiritual path, focused on educating myself in all of these different spheres, including a master's degree in Chinese medicine and doing a bunch of craniosacral therapy and all of these approaches that now I have the perspective of not only did I need the education, but also the kind of healing and the teachers that came with it really helped me move through a process that so many people get stuck in, with kind of a state of grace and ease, and also a heavy dose of like kind of pragmatism and, you know, reality to it as well.
Mhm. That's awesome. So talk about how this body diva can help us to increase our energetic flow, our vitality, our ability to cope with the massive changes that we're going through in today's world.
Well, I'll talk about it in two different ways. The first is that anybody who is going through a spiritual awakening will have information coming up that they won't know how to deal with, they won't know how to process. So they'll start to be aware of patterns in their life that could use healing. And these patterns typically start out from like kind of early childhood and stuff that's conscious, but then they can go into weird stuff, you know, supposedly weird stuff like past lives and ancestral and even cultural sort of patterns. And by using a really body-based perspective, it can stop people from going into kind of these mythic or escapist or just purely kind of mental territories where the work isn't grounded in the body, where it isn't having an impact in the body, and where it doesn't have any grounded reality to it. I will also say, just for people in general, that we are a lot more complex and multifaceted than we give ourselves credit for. We have a lot of reasons for being, and we have a lot of reasons why our lives or our bodies are out of balance. And it's by looking at our individual reasons for being, which can be done through this book, is that we can start to hear that, okay, my lower back pain, it comes from, landing on my butt in that skiing accident, but it also comes from this childhood experience. It also comes from holding an emotion of rage there. It also comes from a past life. And by treating ourselves as these complex, multi-layered beings, we can actually start to get to the root of things and make really large changes in our lives, and really start to evolve ourselves and evolve our lives in a way that can, you know, benefit ourselves as well as our families in the world and all that sort of good stuff.
Yeah, I love that approach because, of course, contemporary medicine looks at the symptoms. How do we deal with the symptoms and fix them? We rarely get to the root causes or core, and you take it even deeper than that and go into everything from family, culture, past lives, all of these different areas. And it is a complex issue in one sense. And in another sense, there's like a kind of simplicity, isn't there, that inside of all that, this energetic flow, this place that we can arrive at that seems to connect us with everything else. I don't know, that's my experience in meditation, is that still place where kind of everything's right there, and it's just this big ball that gets clear. I don't know, that's a little bit of an aside, but
no, it's a good way of describing it. And then my saying after that would be like, okay, what's gunking up people from
skunking? Yes, skunking is a very technical word. Well, you know, a lot of spiritual traditions are really saying that we need to transcend and go beyond the body. And everything I've learned in 50 years of doing this kind of work is that, no, everything really starts in the body. And so many people, like, you know, I teach shamanism, and so many people want to leave their body when they journey in this type of thing, and they end up dissociating, they end up doing spiritual bypass and thinking they've handled an issue that's nowhere near handled, and then they go and project it on everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge problem. I teach kind of in that vein as well at times, although my influence is approached by other methods as well. But there is this common sort of archetype or common person that is, you know, looking to escape their lives and their bodies, or create sort of these mythic creations about having power and connectivity. But when you look at their lives, it isn't showing that. It isn't showing that any of that has integrated, or isn't showing that they've done the work. And one of the most helpful things that I have really taught my students is that if you're doing spiritual work, it should manifest and evolve every aspect of your being. So spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical. And if it isn't integrating in that way, then there's something to look at, or there's something maybe that's going on in one of those spheres, but maybe could stand to be integrated in all of them.
Yeah, that's good. Let's talk about trauma, how energy gets frozen in the body, and how you can use your methods to release that frozen energy.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking about kind of what's gunking up the works, it really is trauma. It's those times in our lives where we've had something that we haven't been able to process. Essentially, we haven't been able to see our way through.
Yeah.
And these could be big events, but they also could be smaller ones, or what's known as micro trauma. For example, if somebody didn't get enough to eat from age 5 to 17, that isn't any large cathartic thing that they can point to, but that's still trauma experienced over time. And what happens with trauma is that an aspect of ourselves does freeze. It either gets stuck or it disassociates, or one of the two. And this is represented in our body. And so in this method, we go into the body, we find all of the sort of stuck or empty places, and we heal the trauma at the source, whatever that source may be. And so the method of the book is pretty simple. It's kind of like, here's talking to your body, here's what your body Deva is, and here's how to approach it. But the ways that we could approach it and what we can find and what is at that source could be so many different things.
Mm-hmm. Of course, in shamanism, they would call many of these things soul loss that come from a trauma. And it doesn't have to be a great trauma. It can be being looked at in a strange way. I always look at the fear that's also there. That I wonder how you look at fear and trauma, because I think of fear as frozen power, frozen ability. How do you pierce through that fear and get someone to actually meet the trauma? And I love the way you go back and look at the beliefs and the what happened and the stories, but take us on a little journey about how you would do that.
Well, the first thing to do is really to understand emotional intelligence. And I go over this in the book, but our emotions have specific purposes. We just no longer have that knowledge in our database. For example, anger is a clear indication that our boundaries have been broached, either psychically or physically. And if we understand this, we can understand, why am I getting so angry in the car when somebody is tailgating me? Or, why am I getting so angry at my boss who's asking me to do 500 things, or something like that. It's through having knowledge and awareness, first of all. But the
It's
second
interesting when you talk about anger, because what I've noticed is what people are angry about is usually never what they're really angry about.
Yeah, and so we get into kind of the second aspect of things, is like, how many of us are really in the present moment? I call these loops, but it's,
Yeah.
we have all these unhealed aspects of self. Our inner 2-year-old may be continually angry, and whenever she or he runs across a situation that reminds them of that original trauma, it's just going to activate that same anger and consolidate the belief there. So, and the other thing I would say in terms of fear is that the way that I approach the body is very compassionately. We bully ourselves and are so hard on ourselves and really try to force ourselves to change. And that really doesn't work. What does work is going to since I mentioned a 2-year-old, like going to our inner 2-year-old and saying, it's completely right that you were totally afraid in that situation. It's completely right that you were feeling angry. That was a really screwed up situation, and your parents didn't do the job that they were supposed to. I'm really sorry that you had to experience that. And working on that level, instead of being like, oh, you're an angry 2-year-old, it's not spiritual to experience anger, so you're not going to experience anger anymore. Like, that really doesn't work. If anything, that inner 2-year-old is just going to, throw a tantrum or something like that. And so it's In some cases, people have done a lot of work. They're ready to heal just whole segments of being, or, maybe they're going through a spiritual awakening in which material is kind of coming up for them, so to speak. But even for people, specifically in the book, I use some people who are not, terribly body conscious or kind of on a spiritual path overall. And they found that things like, oh, wow, I can't play tennis anymore because I have a bum knee. And they talk to their knee. Their knee is like, well, you're in pain because I hurt, but also because 4 years ago you went through a divorce and it kind of knocked you off your feet. And here's what you need to do about it. And so it's by taking small steps or large steps, whatever we're ready for, that fear can sort of be broached, because that fear is really showing us where our limits are, like kind of where the limits of our known universe is, and is blinding us to everything else. And so if we're able to go to those edges, to those limits, wherever they are, and be like, okay, I can take a step beyond this, or maybe I can take 5 steps beyond this. That means working with fear in kind of a gradual way.
Yeah, I like your concept of using the titration, a little bit at a time, slowly moving in, because there's so much resistance to change sometimes. And talk about how that resistance to change and healing, that the protection, how can the body diva help us move through that resistance in a gentle way? Be more specific about how we get that health and wholeness of the knee or the whatever, or the whole gestalt. A little bit about going into, because you have wonderful methodologies in the book of approaching that, and many different aspects of how to approach that. Can you just give us an idea of what you do?
Yeah, again, approaching even something like resistance with compassion, we can begin to understand that resistance is often a protective mechanism. It's saying that, for example, that inner 2-year-old, she really believes that everybody in the world hates her and is out to get her. And if she's approached with any other reality, she's just going to shut that down because she's so stuck in that belief. Or we go to an area of our body, perhaps like, that knee that has been hurt. That knee is going to have some resistance to healing, because not only is it injured, perhaps even injured physically, but that is needed to kind of develop extra padding or extra layers of protection to simply, function throughout the day. So whether we're talking about emotional, spiritual, or physical trauma, our body consolidates that energy. Dr. John Upledger called it an energy cyst, because our bodies really consolidate that energy and make it as small as possible, so the rest of us can kind of, go to the grocery store, feed the cats and the kids and all that sort of stuff. So in terms of working with resistance, I very much in the book treat it as an ally. Ask it what it needs, ask it what it's doing there, ask it what it's afraid of, because it likely has a very, very valid point. And it's by validating that point and acting as if the resistance is an ally, or is trying to its best to kind of do the best it can, and protecting that inner 2-year-old or that knee or whatever, that we can begin to use it as support to look at what's underneath and do a lot of really wonderful healing.
You talk about core emotions in the book. Explain what you mean by a core emotion.
Well, we all have an emotional place that we tend to go to first. And so for a lot of people, this tends to be anger. They kind of have a stockpile of anger built up in them. For a lot of people, their base emotion kind of boils down to fear. But we all have this core emotion, and we'll notice, just how we react to situations, whether it be grief, fear, anger, something like that. And if we're able to notice this core emotion and ask where in our bodies we're holding this emotion, we can start to kind of release the stockpile, as well as start reacting to our current present day reality differently. I use percentages in the book, but it's like, if you react, 20 times more than you should with anger at a situation, 20 times more than it warrants, you can start to work on that stockpile, so you're only reacting 18, and then 10, and then 5, and then maybe reacting appropriately.
Mhm.
And the method is not so people will become zombies and not have any, emotions. It's so people will more vitally feel their emotions and feel them in the present moment with all these loops and wounded selves and all of that sort of stuff kind of within screaming out for attention and kind of exacerbating things.
Well, yeah, I came out of the corporate world, and number one, people are numb in their body. I used to say I work with heads on sticks. Number two, mostly people are numb to their emotions, except maybe what you call a core emotion that you come back to, because anger is what you learned as a 5-year-old, or how to express or get what you want. But there's such a wide variety of the emotional field, and yet mostly at best we have like 5 major emotions, mad, sad, glad, that whole whatever it is.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, I'm really interested in the work you've been doing that interests me around cultural trauma and cultural healing, and how cultural affects both the individual, but also the individual affects the culture. Um, because there is so much, and it's a huge area. I don't want to get too far into it, but such an area of cultural wounding and trauma, cultural trauma, that we're drawing on. What are your thoughts around that area? And the area of grief is one of those aspects. We don't know how to grieve, I believe, at the depth that's appropriate. And I mean really grieving, not wallowing in grief, but really recognizing, oh, we're losing 10,000 species, a year. How do you grieve a species? Is one thing to grieve a parent or a grandparent or even a child, but there's this whole level of cultural grief that's embedded in genocide and slavery, and you mentioned that in your book. So I wanted to jump to that because it's an area that really interests me a lot personally.
Yeah, and so it's one of those things about becoming more conscious of where our patterns come from, is that we do start to kind of contemplate the world as well as cultural energies and, things that go beyond ancestral lineage and past lives, and all that sort of stuff is a wonderful resource for healing. But beyond our ancestors is this idea of the culture that we come from, and that they have ingrained patterns of loss and grief and power loss and soul loss and all that sort of stuff on that level as well. For example, much of my ancestry is Eastern and Central European.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the countries I come from no longer exist anymore. I've had wars for hundreds upon hundreds of years. And so I was kind of with my mother when I was like 13 or 15 or something like that. And she was remarking about how I was also always deep in sort of like existential thought. She's like, oh yeah, that makes sense because none of the countries you come from exist, that sort of thing. And so I'm kind of making light of that. But if we look at our culture, if we look at, first ancestral healing is wonderful, but if we look at our culture as a whole, we see, which in shamanic lingo would be power loss, we would see soul loss, we would see all of these patterns of deep wounding that we're still living out. For example, one of my first experiences of ancestral healing and really being aware of the impact that it had was working on the north side of Chicago, where I was working with a lot of descendants of the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And their lives were going reasonably well in a lot of regards, but we would get to this point where they were doing things like hoarding food or had a huge amount of anxiety, and they'd be embarrassed to talk about these things. But over time, I started to see see these patterns in their behavior and begin to be able to track it back. And it was through their ancestry, of course, but also because of cultural elements as well. And kind of through that, I started realizing that we really do need to look at the culture and how we are passed down trauma in just so many different ways.
Yeah, you're in the States. I mean, you look at what's arising right now in terms of cultural wounding, and you look back at slavery and genocide of the native people, and the fact that in 50 years, I think there's only been 3 years we haven't been at war with some other country, or the American Revolution. All of that is in our culture, and in, you know, people don't think it affects us, but it does.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. And you can look at, I talk about loops a bit in the book, but you can look at on a cultural level, you know, how we're repeating the same things again and again. And ideally, it would be for some sort of healing purposes or some sort of unearthing from the depths of the oceans into consciousness before it kind of, you know, goes back down into those depths or just repeats again without any sort of healing. But you really can start to see these repeating behaviors, both personally as well as culturally, as well as country-wise, you know, that really emerge from trauma. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to start to consider and really become conscious of what's happening in our environment, what's happening in our country, because you do recognize these large patterns of power loss, of trauma being repeated. And, you know, we are one person and we can only do so much. So it is hard to not get into that state of, you know, grief or overwhelm in terms of those patterns.
Well, then there's the terminal busyness and distraction that we live inside of with computers and phones. You know, I've been around young people that never put down their phone. They're completely glued to it, or television and that. So there's so much distracting us and keeping us from being there. And, you know, these emotions, just to not leave that too quickly, when you look at the emotions, there's, yes, when you're angry, it shows there's a boundary issue, say, like you mentioned earlier. Well, it's also a teacher of boundaries, just like fear is a teacher of consciousness and attentiveness. How do you get to that when you're working with people, you know, to get them to actually see the benefit of these so-called unwanted, and something that many people want to change or suppress the anger or get rid of it somehow?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite a dynamic shift and a shift of being to get people to recognize, because we do have such this separation essentially between head and body, you know, our thinking state versus our feeling state. And so getting people to recognize or being less afraid of their bodies. You know, I'm teaching an animist course right now, and some people are afraid to go out and touch a tree because they, you know, deeply afraid of the natural world and the spiritual realms. And what they're really telling me is that they are afraid of themselves. They're afraid of their own bodies. You know, that's kind of what I get from that. And so one of my teachers used to say, you know, how is that working for you? And it was a funny statement, but it had that pure capacity to break through, because people will recognize that their lives just completely stuck in their heads are not working for them. You know, at the beginning, we talked about people kind of involved in shamanism that are looking towards it for a state of escapism or distraction, or to kind of, you know, create this mythic version of themselves because they're really wounded. And some people you just can't break through to, but others you're like, how is that working for you to not be connected to your bodies, to not be connected to your lives? Because it isn't working very well. That disconnection always shows up. And so obviously you don't want to do this too harshly, but people, even if they are completely numbing themselves through whatever agents are out there, television, drugs, et cetera, they know at the core of their being, there's going to be that small voice that's saying something in your life is incorrect, something in your life isn't working. And if you're able to gear people towards that voice and to be like, you know, maybe some things in your life could improve or get better, or, you know, you could be a bit more connected to yourself or to the world or to the spiritual realms or whatever's going on. A lot of people are really open to that sentiment, because on some level they recognize that disconnection is there.
Yeah, so true. That raises 5 other questions here, but one of the things that I wanted to look at a little more is understanding looping beliefs and these the self-reinforcing of our wounds that happens, because I think that's such an important thing for people to recognize, how the beliefs that we have shape our perception, or our perception is shaped by our beliefs, and that gives us our worldview. And so these are really beliefs that are looping and coming around. And talk about how to decompose or break down, deconstruct is what the word I was looking for, deconstruct these beliefs so that we can really get to see, wait, is this really true, or is this something I've taken on from my family, from my culture, from my experience as a child, or I want to talk about at some point in utero, but just in general, the looping that takes place, and the idea that, or the sense that we can actually, by deconstructing and looking at these beliefs, we can lessen their hold on us and create new beliefs.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the concept of loops, loops are repetitive behaviors, essentially, or repetitive beliefs. So they're the things that we tell ourselves 800 times, or the things that the media tells us 800 times. And if this is happening, we can pretty much be assured that what is going on is illusory, because what happens is that if we believe something, we don't need to convince ourselves 800 times. If we believe something, we don't need to convince other people 800 times. It's just an aspect of our being is integrated. We don't need to spend a lot of time and energy on it. And so people are really aware, actually, of these sort of repetitions or loops, because they'll have the same behaviors going on again and again. We could talk about it in terms of, health and stuff that happens there. But in terms of trauma, let's say that a 5-year-old's parents divorced because his mother cheated on, the father. And so based off of that experience, that was too overwhelming for the 5-year-old, as well as the 5-year-old took on the belief that all women cheat. And so anytime that he goes out into the world, he's not only projecting that energy of that 5-year-old onto all of the women that he meets, but any sort of slight or anything that they do that triggers that initial wounding is just going to consolidate that loop. And he's just that inner 5-year-old is, as much as that inner 5-year-old wants to heal, there's also that aspect of that inner 5-year-old that's like, you know what, I'm right, all women cheat, or something like that. So that's kind of a crass example, but that's exactly what happens. We have these wounded aspects of ourselves and get traumatized in the original circumstances, as well as the beliefs about the self, or beliefs about the nature of the world, or men or women, or whatever's going on. Those get kind of frozen with the trauma. And so what happens is that person may be 45, but that inner 5-year-old is continually going out looking to cast others into that role of absent mother, or cheating mother, or whatever's going on. And sometimes it can be quite funny, is like you'll meet men who will break up with a woman, or a woman with whomever, and they'll find a partner that is exactly like their last one, and you're just repeating the same thing with a different name and face.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So beliefs are really how we see the world.
Yeah.
And we're very attached to our beliefs and this looping mechanism. So there are a number of ways that you have to get at those beliefs. And you mentioned earlier the inner child, and in the book you talk about the inner children, because it's more than one sense of that. So how do you distinguish that from say a past life, or a cultural thing, or the different ways that we form these beliefs? How does the Diva, approach that to break it down and find the roots of it?
Well, generally, what happens is that we do have to work on our own childhood first. That typically is what comes up for people. And it's an understandable place. We're conscious of most of it. You know, we're comfortable with most of it socially because we have psychology and all that sort of stuff that's kind of in our framework. So that's a good step for us. And that's typically where most of the stuff will come up for them first is their known history. In terms of the body Deva work, what starts to happen is that once you formulate a relationship with the body Deva as a whole, is that you can ask the body Deva as a whole or the individual body part that you're working with, what age things are coming from. You know, is this a past life? Is this ancestral? And in the book, I talk about this, but what you're looking for is that sense of knowing or a shift in energy in the structure. And again, I return again and again to the physical body because it is so easy to get kind of lost in our mental capacities. With this work, you really should see a shift in the energy of that body part, a shift in what you're visualizing, you're sensing, you're feeling there, as well as a shift in your body map, which is essentially a little drawing of a stick figure that you can create as a tool as well as a shift in your life. And again, returning to that idea of like spiritual work really should impact your daily reality, your daily life, your body. And so I'm quite clear in the book, like that not only we have this wonderful intuitive resource that has a lot more information than we consciously are aware of, but that we just need to kind of tap into it.
Yeah, that's great. I love your little body map, but I would suggest you stick with what you're doing and not go into art school.
Yeah, I actually do paint a bit, but you know, that definitely is not, actually I have another book coming out next year and people always talk about Kundalini awakenings like you're going to be this great genius and everything. And I'm like, I'm still the same painter and artist that I always was, you know?
But not limited by your beliefs, eh?
Yeah, but not limited by my beliefs. I just consider it fun, you know?
So one of the things I really enjoyed, Mary Shutan, is the relationship to contracts. It reminded me of the Ruiz work. These beliefs are contracts. So talk about the concept of contracts and changing contracts that we made at these earlier ages.
Yeah, and so contracts are really consolidated beliefs. And so we can create contracts with ourselves, or we can create contracts with other people, or have other people create contracts with us. And they can be something as simple as, like in the book, I talk about a young man who wasn't able to climb up to the rope ladder, you know, in gym, and his gym teacher made fun of him and said, you know, that you'll never be physically worth anything. And so what happens is that it's, you know, 20 years later and he's doing all of this CrossFit stuff, and he figures out that he's doing this all because of this contract to this individual, not because he wants to do it for, you know, his self-worth or something like that. And so, you know, we take on all of these contracts, especially from our parents and people that we care about, relationships. You know, how many people have been in relationships where somebody say something to them like, you'll never find anybody like me again, and then they go through and they can't find another partner after they've broken up or something like that.
And those are kind of retro contracts, though. You know, it's taking the opposite position too. So sometimes we're like the person, and oftentimes I will not be like my father was. And if we look in the mirror at 40 or 50 and we go, oh my God, this is my father's face, and those are my father's words coming out of my mouth.
Yeah, exactly. And so I talk about with contracts about how we can have kind of a typical contract, or we can have a reactive one. For example, somebody who had a good experience with their mother may be like, I want to be exactly like my mother. And somebody who had a horrible experience with their mother will be like, I am going to live my life exactly the opposite of hers. And both individuals may wake up one day and realize that there are contracts there. And even if they allowed for them to do wonderful things in their lives, or have prevented them from making, you know, kind of the same mistakes as their mothers in this experience, they still are limiting their reality to a certain degree. They still are conferring this set of expectations, this set of beliefs, this kind of limitations to themselves and to the universe. And so in the book, I go over how to, work with them and how to free yourself from them.
Yeah, I love that part. One of the parts that I particularly related to, I related to the whole book, but was the healing in utero. And one of the reasons I was fascinated was from my own personal life. Both my parents were at Pearl Harbor. I was born between two atomic bombs with people who were in the military. And I'm interested in that because I work with people with PTSD, and I would say my parents were poster child. My mother committed suicide when I was 2.5. So this whole area of healing in utero and the traumas that happen in utero, I'd love to hear more, have you share about that and your findings and your experience about that. It's a controversial subject, I know.
It is. I have a background in craniosacral therapy, which goes over a lot of kind of the pre and perinatal trauma, and it very much taps into the watery aspects of our being. And so when we're in utero, we don't have any energetic or psychic barriers from our mothers. And so what happens is that we can so easily take on of course, kind of physical lack of nutrition and neglect, or maybe even emotions like her not wanting, the child, or being ambivalent, or it causing a lot of stress. But like her emotions, how she was doing at the time, her own trauma, the father's reaction to the pregnancy, all of those sorts of things can either create an in utero environment that feels really warm and safe and the person wants to enter the world, or it can create an environment where, the person emerges, already traumatized. And one of the biggest areas that you'll see this in are people that feel totally disconnected from the world, from the earth, from themselves. They create all these beliefs about that they're kind of like fairy goddess ET sort of thing. And, I'm all about strange things happening, but at the same point, it's like, let's look at what is preventing you from being here in your bodies. And it's typically that in utero time. And on some level, them registering that they were not wanted here.
Yeah, the ascension may have been postponed. You better get to work, huh?
Yeah.
So I want to underline something you just said, though, and that is that when you have these in utero traumas, there's a direct relationship to your relationship to the earth. Say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, essentially we're, bathing in this time, we're in this sea, and we're taking on these emotions from our mother, but we're also growing and preparing ourselves to meet the world. And so the in utero time, we can either be in a state where our mothers and ourselves and our family are really ready for this, and it's a time of excitement, a time of quickening, and, time of celebration. And so things like the in utero experience, as well as the birth experience, can be that time of celebration, that time of warmth, that time of connection, or in a lot of cases it cannot be, and the person comes into the world and it's really cold and they're taken away from their mothers, or whatever is going on. But that in utero experience is really the time spiritually where we're going to be like, okay, it's great that we incarnated again. I'm getting ready to be here. I'm growing. I'm creating a nervous system. I'm creating a physical form that's going to meet the earth, that's really excited about being here. Or there could be some hiccups in that.
Mm-hmm. And just generally, overall, the mother wound you talk about, say more about the mother wound, not just in utero, but in general.
Well, I mean, we obviously have a relationship with both of our parents that is rather deep and, psychically formed and all of that sort of stuff. But in terms of the mothers, we have this deep connection to our mothers. And we feel this bonding and connection because we had it in terms of the cord, in terms of growing inside of her, in terms of really being one with her in a way that we are not going to have with anybody else. And so this mothering wound means that if the mother isn't doing well, the child will start to take psychic, energetic, or even physical responsibility for her safety and to basically ensure their own, but also because this sort of psychic barrier or distinguishment between energies doesn't really start to happen until the child really goes off to school. If then that should be the natural initiation of when they're like kind of 5 or 6 and starting to kind of make their way in the world. But there is just this huge link, this huge bond that is formed from being at one and growing with your mother and having this huge psychic link, and it can provide a lot of wounding to a lot of people. It's seen quite a lot.
Yeah, I certainly understand that one. Power, big issue. So many people today feel powerless in the face of the changes, particularly in the States, with the huge divisiveness. And I think at the heart of so much of that is the belief of separation from our body, separation from each other, and separation from the earth and life itself and our community and our culture. In shamanism, of course, one of the first signs of soul loss is power loss of power. Talk about, from your perspective, the power loss and power gain game, actually.
Power game, that's a good word for it. So what I will say is that this work in doing any sort of, depth work is really shadow work. And what that is understanding that the outer world and the people in it are really externally, they're showing you what your inner wounds are. And so it's really easy for people to point to extremists, extreme racists, extreme sexist, and, all of those sorts of people should be pointed out. But it's really through each one of us doing our own shadow work and working with ourselves gradually over time to look at our own, where we may hate, where we may feel separated, that we can not only heal ourselves, heal those areas of separation within ourselves, but that we can do our part of healing the kind of collective shadow, because we co-create our reality together. We're all responsible for creating, the shadow. Yes, some people right now may be easier to point out blame than others, but still it's by each one of us taking personal responsibility and taking our power back by doing so. That we really can make a change in ourselves as well as the outer world. And I will also say about power is that a lot of people get locked in their heads. We've talked about this, and doing inner work is great, but pair it with external work is a wonderful thing. And so we can't really do anything on a huge global scale, or most of us can't. Maybe, Elon Musk can, or somebody like that. But what we can do is do the best that we can in whatever small ways to see where we can be of benefit to others, to see where we can take small steps in our lives to really contribute to this world being a better place to inhabit. It's so easy to break down. It's so easy to kind of project our shadows outward. And so we really need people that are willing to take that back and that be more in their power, basically.
I have a brother who's a staunch Republican and lives in California. And he was telling a story. He was at a car dealer and someone offered him a ride in Mendocino, and they were going back to his house because his car was being fixed. And in the conversation, she discovered that he voted for Trump. And she slammed on the brakes and yelled at him, told him to get out of the car. And it was a great metaphor for me. Like, had that been me, I would have gone, really? Why did you do that? What, to try to understand. And I think at the heart of so much of what we're talking about is really to have curiosity and understanding and a sense of wonder and to actually be able to access this, to be open instead of to be closed down. So so much more to say about that, Mary Mueller Shutan, and we are at the end of our time together. I want to plug your book again, The Body Diva, Working with the Spiritual Consciousness of the Body. A wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And your website also is maryshutan.com, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, maryshutan.com, and just express our gratitude for all of our listeners for taking the time to be with us on Conversations today. It's really wonderful to be with you, and keep up the great work. Your books are wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. Great to kind of chat with all of this stuff with a, fellow
Yeah,
fellow person who understands.
it's a pleasure. So you be well, and keep me in touch when your next book is coming out.
Sounds good.
All right, bye for now.
Bye.